One single night changed everything forever. When my husband packed his bags and left for the weekend, I was left alone with his nephew, a quiet, shy guy who barely ever said a word. But as the darkness settled over the house, that night felt completely different from any other. An intense, unspoken tension arose between us, something so magnetic that neither of us could possibly ignore it. Want to find out how this dramatic evening unfolded and how it all ended? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue. The night my husband asked me to look after his young nephew turned out to be one of the most unusual, intense, and unforgettable experiences of my entire life. It all started a couple of weeks ago. The late afternoon sun was slowly descending beneath the distant horizon, painting the city buildings in deep hues of soft orange and amber light. I stood quietly by the window of our two-story townhouse, watching the world outside transition into evening. From down on the street, the distant rumble of evening traffic blended with the faint, muffled hum of people walking by. Normally, that kind of quiet solitude at the end of the day brought me a deep sense of peace. But that specific evening, the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Robert, my husband, had packed his bags and left earlier that afternoon for a mandatory corporate weekend retreat. It certainly wasn't the first time he had traveled for work, but for some reason, this time everything felt completely different. Perhaps it was because of the lingering words he said right before heading out the door. When he leaned in to kiss my cheek, he hesitated for a moment, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Evelyn, please keep an eye on James while I'm gone. He's still trying to adjust to everything. I really don't want him feeling like an outsider or a guest in our home. Do whatever you can to make him feel completely at home." James, his nephew, was only 19 years old. He had just recently graduated from high school and was preparing to start his freshman year at a local college in our city. He had arrived at our doorstep just days prior with 2 heavy backpacks slung over his shoulders, timid, soft-spoken, but deeply grateful for a place to stay. Robert had insisted that we host him for a few weeks to help him get on his feet, and I was more than happy to agree. James had proven to be polite, quiet, and respectful, possessing a gentle, understated charm that made him very easy to be around. However, the moment Robert drove away, the entire energy inside the house subtly shifted. The silence grew deeper, carrying a strange, unfamiliar charge. Up until that point, James and I had always maintained a friendly, light-hearted rapport. But as the twilight faded into deep night and the house sank into complete quiet, I felt an undeniable surge of inner tension. It wasn't dangerous or scary, but it was profoundly different. Maybe it was simply the absence of Robert's dominant presence, or maybe it was something brewing beneath the surface that I couldn't quite put into words. Around 7 o'clock, the familiar creak of the wooden stairs broke the stillness. James appeared at the doorway of the living room. His dark hair was slightly messy, tossing carelessly over his forehead, and he was wearing a casual pair of worn jeans and an oversized hoodie. He paused and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that instantly made him look a few years younger. "Hey, Aunt Evelyn," he said in a soft, calm voice. "Uncle Robert mentioned you'd be staying in all weekend." "Yes, I am," I replied, carefully closing the book I had been holding, though truth be told, I hadn't absorbed a single sentence on the page. He didn't want you wandering around or feeling lonely. He really worries way too much. "Honestly, I'm doing fine," James said with a quiet laugh, walking over and settling onto the far end of the sofa. A heavy, comfortable silence settled between us. As I looked at him, I couldn't help but notice how relaxed he seemed. He stretched his long legs out in front of him with a natural ease that I hadn't observed in him before. "Have you eaten yet? Are you hungry?" I asked after a brief pause, breaking the silence. "To be completely honest, yeah, I'm starving," he admitted, sitting up straight. "What are we making for dinner?" We walked into the kitchen together, deciding to whip up something warm and comforting, a classic pasta with homemade garlic tomato sauce. James immediately insisted on helping, and without even trying, we fell into a surprisingly effortless rhythm. He confidently stood at the cutting board chopping up fresh vegetables while I stood over the stove stirring the simmering sauce. The kitchen quickly filled with light-hearted banter, teasing, and playful stories. "Look at you. You actually know what you're doing," I remarked, watching how skillfully he handled the knife while slicing tomatoes. "Hey, give me some credit," he replied with a sly grin. "Honestly, I was half expecting you to accidentally burn boiling water." "Oh, very funny," I snorted, playfully rolling my eyes, but I couldn't stop myself from laughing out loud. We sat down at the small wooden dining table under the dim, warm glow of the overhead lamp to eat. The conversation flowed far more smoothly than I had anticipated. He talked about his nerve-wracking plans for college, his initial impressions of moving to the big city, and funny stories about Robert's younger days. James spoke with a sudden, mature confidence, and I found myself leaning in, listening to every single word with genuine fascination. When dinner was over, we cleaned up and wandered back into the living room. James instinctively claimed his spot on the couch, while I sank into the velvet armchair across from him. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the soft crackle of the fireplace, my eyes kept drifting back to him. He appeared remarkably calm, grounded, and self-assured. "Thank you for dinner, Evelyn," he said softly after a long pause. "It was really nice. You really didn't have to go through all that trouble for me." "It was my absolute pleasure, James," I answered, meeting his gaze. Silence fell over the room once again. Our eyes locked, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though the physical space between us had suddenly shrunk. An electric, unspoken tension hung thick in the air, indefinite, heavy, yet undeniably real. I should probably head upstairs and get some sleep," he muttered, though his body remained completely still on the couch. "Of course," I murmured, my heart suddenly taking a noticeably faster beat against my ribs. "Get some rest." He lingered for a few more agonizing seconds, searching my face, before finally standing up and stretching. "Good night, Aunt Evelyn." "Good night, James." I sat perfectly still, watching him walk toward the stairs and ascend into the shadows until the sound of his footsteps completely vanished into his bedroom. I remained seated in that armchair for a very long time. The warm flames in the fireplace flickered quietly, casting long shadows across the walls, while my racing thoughts kept spinning back to him. There was something undeniably distinct about his behavior tonight, something subtle, magnetic, and impossible to push out of my mind. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and head upstairs. The hallway was almost pitch black, saved only by the soft, golden light filtering out from beneath James's door. As I passed by, I noticed his door was left slightly ajar. I unconsciously slowed my pace, catching the faint, rhythmic sound of his steady breathing. Shaking my head to force those stray thoughts out of my mind, I hurried into my own bedroom. I changed into my silk pajamas and crawled under the cold bedsheets, but rest was completely out of reach. My mind kept replaying every single detail of the evening. His soft smile, his quiet confidence, and the way his intense gaze had lingered on me just a little longer than it should have. I rolled onto my back and stared blankly at the dark ceiling. My heart was pounding unnaturally fast, and sleep felt millions of miles away. The silence engulfing the entire house felt almost heavy enough to touch. And right there, in the oppressive quiet of the night, I realized I couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. "James?" I called out softly into the darkness, my voice barely louder than a whisper. From across the hall, I heard a faint rustle of bedsheets, followed almost immediately by his deep, sleepy, yet warm voice. "Yeah." I got out of bed, quietly walked over to his room, and gently pushed the door open. James was sitting up in his bed, the dark duvet pulled up to his waist. His dark hair was messy, and his eyes were heavy with sleep, yet completely fixed on me with intense alertness. I can't seem to sleep," I confessed, standing awkwardly near the doorway, suddenly feeling exposed. A tiny, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he tilted his head to the side. "Neither can I." We stood frozen in that silence for what felt like an eternity, simply staring directly into each other's eyes. The air in the bedroom grew thick with an overwhelming, palpable tension. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, James reached out his hand and gently patted the empty space on the mattress right next to him. "Do you want to come sit down?" he asked in a low, husky whisper. Every logical instinct inside my brain screamed at me that walking into that room was a dangerous line to cross. But looking at him, seeing the raw sincerity, vulnerability, and quiet warmth burning in his eyes, made it absolutely impossible to turn away. I took a deep breath, walked across the room, and sat down on the edge of his bed, carefully maintaining a cautious distance between us. "Is something heavy on your mind?" he asked gently, leaning in slightly, his eyes full of quiet curiosity. "I'm not really sure," I admitted after a long, heavy silence. I feel really restless tonight." He nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact for a single second. "Me too." The room fell completely silent once more. The atmosphere felt charged, heavy with unsaid thoughts, hidden desires, and words we were both too afraid to speak aloud. I stole a quick glance at his face in the dim lighting. He looked completely different like this, stripped of his usual shyness, raw and utterly vulnerable. "I'm really glad you came in here," he suddenly whispered, cutting through the heavy quiet. I turned my head to face him, my brows knitting together slightly. "Why?" He shrugged his shoulders, briefly dropping his gaze down to his hands resting on his lap. "Because it's just really nice having someone around who actually understands." "Understands what, James?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. He raised his head and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was piercing, completely honest, and devoid of any walls. "What it feels like to be completely lonely. To feel like you're surrounded by people, but no one actually sees who you really are inside." His words struck a chord deep within my chest, hitting me with overwhelming force. A sharp lump formed in my throat, and tears threatened to gather in my eyes. "I see you, James," I whispered softly, the words escaping my lips before I even had the chance to process them. He looked slightly taken aback by my answer, but didn't say a word. Slowly, carefully, he reached out his hand and let his fingers brush against mine. It was a soft, delicate touch, almost accidental on the surface, yet it carried an undeniable, surging intensity that sent a shockwave straight through me. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared at our touching hands, completely paralyzed, not knowing what to do or say next. "It's okay," James whispered gently, noticing my visible confusion and trembling breath. "I just really needed to know that I'm not completely alone tonight, even if it's only for a single moment."